The morning light crept gently across the curtains, soft and golden. A sharp contrast to the heaviness Sarah had carried for months. She stirred awake slowly, her body tense from another restless night. But this time there was something different about the silence of the house. It wasn't the empty, suffocating quiet she had grown used to since Daniel's passing. It was softer, warmer. Her mind flickered back to the night before the firelight. Michael's steady voice, the weight of his words about Daniel's request, and the way his presence had filled the room with a strength she hadn't realized she was craving. She had gone to bed, shaken, confused, and yet strangely comforted. Sarah rose, wrapped her robe around her, and padded softly toward the kitchen. She paused in the hallway. The scent of coffee drifted through the air, rich and familiar. Her heart jumped. For months, mornings had been silent. The only coffee made was her own rushed cup, swallowed half cold while trying to hide her tears from Ethan. But now, someone else was in her kitchen. When she stepped in, she found Michael at the counter pouring steaming coffee into mugs. He looked natural there, as though he had done it countless times before. The sight tugged at something deep in her chest. "Morning," he said with a small smile. His voice was gentle, careful, as though testing whether it was okay for him to belong in that space. Sarah blinked back the sudden sting in her eyes. "Morning," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Ethan entered a moment later, his hair tousled from sleep. He froze at the sight of Michael, then grinned in a way Sarah hadn't seen in months. "You stayed." Michael nodded. "Guest room was comfortable. I hope you don't mind." "Of course not," Ethan said quickly, sliding into a chair. "It's good. It feels good having you here." Sarah's heart tightened at her son's words. She had worried so much about Ethan, about whether he was bottling up too much grief. And here he was, brighter, lighter, because of Michael's presence. It was both comforting and terrifying as they sat together at the table. Sarah found her gaze drifting to Michael's hands, strong, capable, yet gentle as he passed Ethan the milk for his cereal. Daniel's absence was still sharp, but for the first time, the ache wasn't accompanied by suffocating loneliness. Instead, there was a fragile sense of possibility. When Ethan had finished eating, he lingered for a moment, then looked directly at his mother. His eyes were steady, older than his years. "Mom," he said carefully, "about what I asked you last night." Sarah's breath caught. "I didn't mean to upset you," Ethan continued. I don't want you to think loving Dad means you can't ever be happy again. I saw how you looked at Michael yesterday, and I think—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "I think Dad would want you to smile again." Sarah's chest ached, her throat tight with unshed tears. She wanted to tell Ethan he was wrong, that she could never imagine replacing Daniel. But deep down, she knew her son's words weren't about replacing anyone. They were about survival, about choosing to live even after heartbreak. Michael stayed quiet, respectful, his gaze lowered to his mug. He didn't push, didn't intrude. And in that silence, Sarah realized something important. This wasn't about rushing into something new. It was about allowing the possibility of healing. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached across the table to take Ethan's hand. His grip was warm, strong, grounding. "Ethan," she said softly, "your father was and always will be the love of my life. Nothing will ever change that. But maybe love doesn't end when someone dies. Maybe it just changes shape." Ethan's eyes shimmered and he nodded, squeezing her hand. For the first time since Daniel's death, they weren't just sharing grief. They were sharing hope. She glanced at Michael, who looked up then, meeting her eyes. His gaze held no demands, no pressure, only understanding. And in that look, Sarah saw the truth. She didn't have to choose between holding on to Daniel's memory and opening her heart to the future. She could carry both. Later that day, Michael offered to help with small chores around the house, fixing a loose cabinet hinge, shoveling snow from the porch. He moved through the space carefully, never overstepping. But his presence filled the house with a steadiness Sarah hadn't realized she missed so deeply as she watched him from the doorway. Sarah's mind replayed Daniel's words that Michael had shared the night before. "If anything ever happened to me, I hope you'll look after them." It was almost as if Daniel had left her a gift she hadn't been ready to see until now. That evening, after Ethan had gone upstairs to finish his homework, Sarah and Michael sat by the fire once again. The silence between them was different, no gentle, comforting. She wrapped Daniel's flannel shirt around her shoulders, and Michael glanced at it with a soft smile. "You still wear it?" he said quietly. "Every night," she admitted, her voice breaking. "It's the closest thing I have to him." Michael nodded. "That's okay. You don't have to let go of him to keep moving forward." Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know what forward looks like yet." "You don't have to," Michael said. His voice was steady. "Sure. You just have to take one step at a time. And if you'll let me, I'll walk beside you." The firelight danced in his eyes. And for the first time in months, Sarah felt a spark inside her chest that wasn't just grief. It was small, fragile, but it was hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or if her heart would ever be ready for more. But sitting there with Michael's quiet presence beside her and her son upstairs, finally at peace, Sarah realized something profound. Love doesn't die with loss. It transforms, it shifts, it finds new ways to bloom. And in that quiet living room, snow falling gently outside, Sarah whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, maybe this is the beginning of something new. The story of heartbreak was no longer only about loss. It was slowly, gently becoming a story of hope. The night air rushed in as Sarah opened the door, cold and sharp against her skin. Snowflakes swirled past the porch light, clinging to the heavy boots of the man who stood before her. For a moment, she thought her eyes were playing tricks. "Michael," she whispered. The man nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. His face was rugged, touched by years and weather, with streaks of gray in his hair. But his eyes, steady, kind, and deeply familiar, hadn't changed at all. "I was passing through town," Michael said softly, brushing snow from his jacket. "I thought I should check on you and Ethan." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't seen Michael in years, not since a summer barbecue when Ethan was still a boy running barefoot in the grass. Michael had been Daniel's closest friend from college, almost like a brother. Back then, he had visited often, filling the house with his easy laughter. But life had pulled them apart. He moved west for work, and their contact had faded to the occasional Christmas card. And now here he was, on her doorstep on a night when her heart was already so raw from Ethan's question. "Uncle Mike." Ethan's voice came from behind her. Sarah turned to see her son, his eyes widening with recognition. For the first time in weeks, Ethan's face lit up. "Come in, come in." Michael stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them, and for a brief moment, the house felt less empty. Sarah closed the door, her mind spinning. "How long has it been?" Michael asked, glancing between them. "Too long," Sarah admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. They moved into the living room, and Ethan, surprisingly animated, began asking Michael questions about his travels, about his work, about memories of his father. Michael answered with patience, his voice steady. Filling the silence that had haunted the house since Daniel's death, Sarah watched them from her chair by the fire. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes brighter than she had seen in months. Michael spoke with warmth, but never once with pity. And Sarah realized with a sudden pang how much her son needed this another male figure. Someone who carried pieces of Daniel in the way he spoke, the stories he told. Hours passed easily. Eventually, Ethan excused himself, claiming he had homework. He gave Michael a hug before heading upstairs, something he hadn't done with anyone in weeks. Sarah's chest tightened at the sight, when the sound of Ethan's footsteps faded. Sarah found herself alone with Michael. The fire crackled, shadows dancing on the walls. She became suddenly aware of the stillness between them, not empty, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken memories. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I should have come sooner." Her throat tightened. "You had your own life, your own things. I understand. Michael shook his head. His eyes, deep and serious now, met hers. Daniel was my best friend, Sarah. He was more like a brother to me. And when I heard what happened, I didn't just lose him. I lost part of my family too. The words hit her hard. She lowered her gaze, staring at her hands clasped in her lap. It's been hard, she admitted. Every day feels like walking through fog. I keep trying to stay strong for Ethan, but her voice faltered. Sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending. Michael leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. You don't have to pretend with me. Her eyes lifted. And for the first time that evening, she saw something in his gaze she hadn't expected, an understanding that went beyond sympathy. Michael wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her as someone who had known Daniel almost as well as she had. Someone who carried the same grief, but in a different shape. Silence stretched again, broken only by the popping of the fire. Sarah's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the strange comfort of his presence. Then Michael spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. Sarah, there's something you should know. Years ago, Daniel told me, if anything ever happened to him, he hoped I'd look after you and Ethan. The words landed like a stone in her chest. She blinked, her breath catching. He said that. Michael nodded slowly. We were sitting on the porch one night after you'd gone inside. He laughed when he said it, like it was just a passing thought. But the way he looked at me, I knew he meant it. Sarah's emotions tangled inside her grief. Confusion, a flicker of something she didn't dare name. Part of her felt betrayed, as if Daniel had been preparing for a day she couldn't bear to imagine. But another part of her felt strangely comforted. It's like Daniel had left behind a thread to guide her through the darkness. Her voice shook. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Michael said gently. I'm not here to take Daniel's place. No one could. I just don't want you to feel alone in this. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She pressed her hands against her face, ashamed of breaking down yet again. But Michael didn't flinch, didn't turn away. He simply sat there, steady as the firelight, his presence anchoring her in the storm. When she finally lowered her hands, their eyes met again. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the hollow silence she had grown used to. It was a silence filled with possibility, with something fragile but alive. Sarah's heart trembled. She wasn't ready, she might never be ready. But for the first time since Daniel's death, she didn't feel completely lost. Michael leaned back, giving her space, as if he understood exactly what she needed. It's late, he said softly. I should let you rest. Do you have a guest room? Yes, she whispered. Her voice cracked, but there was relief in knowing he would be under the same roof, even just for the night, as she led him down the hall. Sarah felt Ethan's question from earlier echoing in her chest. Would you ever think about loving someone again? She didn't know the answer, not yet. But as Michael disappeared into the guest room and she stood alone in the hallway, she realized something had shifted. The emptiness of the house didn't feel quite so unbearable anymore, and that frightened her more than anything. The first weeks after Daniel's funeral were a blur for Sarah. The world outside seemed to keep moving. But inside her home in Vermont, time stood still. The house, once full of laughter, footsteps, and music, now felt like a shell, quiet, hollow, and unbearably lonely dots. Sarah often found herself staring at the family pictures on the wall. In them, Daniel's smile was wide, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders. And their son Ethan, still a boy then, grinning with his father's same brown eyes. She remembered when those pictures had been taken, moments that had felt ordinary at the time but now seemed golden. Its untouchable dot. The silence weighed on her most in the evenings. After Ethan went upstairs, she would sit by the fireplace, listening to the wood crackle and pop, a sound that once felt cozy but now only reminded her of what was missing. Daniel had always been the one to light the fire, his large hands steady, his voice humming a tune under his breath. Now Sarah lit it alone, and the warmth did little to chase away the cold emptiness inside her chest. She tried to stay strong for Ethan. At 17, he was still so young. Though his shoulders were beginning to broaden like his father's, he carried himself with a quiet strength. And sometimes Sarah could almost see the man he was becoming. But grief had stolen something from him, too. He didn't talk much, didn't laugh the way he used to. He came home from school, did his homework, ate his dinner, and disappeared into his room. Sarah worried about him, but she didn't know how to reach him. Whenever she tried to bring up Daniel, Ethan's jaw tightened, and he quickly changed the subject. She longed to hold him close, to let him cry into her arms like he had when he was small. But he was at that age where boys tried to be strong even when they were breaking inside. The truth was, Sarah wasn't sure how to be strong either. She missed Daniel in ways she didn't even have words for. The quiet of the house wasn't just silence, it was absence. No one came through the door with muddy boots. No one asked what was for dinner. No one leaned over the back of the couch to kiss her cheek while she read Dot at night. When the world outside was dark and still, Sarah lay awake in bed, her hand unconsciously reaching for the other side of the mattress. It was cold, untouched. She would turn on her side, clutching Daniel's old flannel shirt against her chest, breathing in what little scent of him still lingered. It was all she had left. And sometimes she wondered how long before even that faded. One particular evening, she sat in front of the fire with the shirt wrapped around her shoulders. The flames flickered shadows on the walls, casting shapes that reminded her of the life she had lost. Ethan came downstairs, his footsteps hesitant. Sarah glanced up, expecting him to ask about homework or maybe a snack, but his expression was different. Daniel's eyes were troubled, searching, as if he were carrying a question too heavy for him to hold alone. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before finally stepping closer. His voice was quiet, uncertain, almost afraid. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask you something." Sarah felt her breath catch. Something in his tone sent a shiver through her. It wasn't the voice of a boy asking for money or permission or even advice. It was deeper, raw, the kind of voice that came only when something important, something life-changing was about to be spoken. Her heart began to pound. And for the first time in weeks, the silence in the house didn't feel empty. It felt like the pause before a storm. What could Ethan possibly want to ask her now? In this moment, with the firelight flickering and Daniel's absence so heavy between them, Sarah wasn't ready. She wasn't sure she could handle whatever words were about to come out of her son's mouth. And yet, deep down, she knew this was the moment when the walls of grief might finally begin to crack. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what Ethan would say next. Ethan stood by the fireplace, the glow of the flames reflecting in his eyes. Sarah's hands tightened on Daniel's flannel shirt, her breath shallow as she waited for her son to speak. The silence stretched between them long enough that she almost asked him what was wrong. But she stopped herself. Something about the way he stood, their shoulders slightly hunched, lips pressed together, told her this wasn't something she could rush. Finally, his words came, soft and fragile. "Mom, are you lonely?" Sarah froze. Of all the things she had braced herself to hear, questions about money, about college, about the pain of losing his father, this was not it. She had built her grief into a kind of fortress, keeping her feelings carefully tucked away, especially around Ethan. She thought she had hidden her loneliness well enough. But her son, quiet and observant, had seen right through her. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The word lonely echoed in her chest, tearing down the walls she had tried so hard to build. She wanted to say, "No, sweetheart. I'm fine. I'm strong. You don't have to worry about me." But the truth pressed against her ribs, aching to be spoken. Ethan shifted awkwardly, his gaze flickering to the fire. His voice trembled, though he tried to steady it. "I miss Dad every day," he admitted, his jaw tightening. "But sometimes I feel like I don't just miss him for me. I miss him for you too. I see you sitting here staring at the fire or looking at his pictures. And I don't want you to spend the rest of your life sad." The words pierced Sarah's heart. She reached out, wanting to comfort him, but her hand fell back to her lap. Tears burned behind her eyes. She hadn't realized how much Ethan was watching her, how much of her pain he was carrying silently on his own shoulders. "Ethan, she whispered, her throat tight. He looked at her then, straight into her eyes. His were red-rimmed, though he hadn't cried in front of her in months. Would you? Would you ever think about loving someone again? The room tilted, as if the ground had shifted beneath her. Sarah's breath caught. The question was too big, too raw, too soon. Her first instinct was to protest. How could she? Daniel had been her first love, her only love. His laughter still echoed in the walls. His scent lingered faintly in the closets. His memory was stitched into every fiber of her being. To imagine someone else in that space felt like betrayal. And yet, Ethan's face was so open, so pleading. He wasn't asking out of selfishness or carelessness. He wasn't trying to erase his father. He was trying to give his mother permission to live again, to smile, to breathe without guilt. Sarah swallowed hard, her voice shaking. Ethan, your father was. He was my whole world. I don't know how to even think about what you're asking. I know, Ethan said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. I'm not saying forget him. I could never forget him. But maybe Dad wouldn't want you to be alone forever. Maybe he'd want you to find happiness again. You deserve that. The tears finally spilled over, sliding down Sarah's cheeks. Her son, still so young, was speaking words with the weight of a man. She wanted to hold him, to tell him he didn't need to carry her future on his shoulders. But deep down, she knew his question wasn't just about her. It was about them both. He needed to know that life didn't end with Daniel's death. That love could exist beyond grief. Sarah tried to form an answer, but her voice broke apart. I don't know. Ethan didn't push. He simply nodded, his eyes soft, understanding. He stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder, awkward but strong. And for the first time since Daniel's passing, Sarah felt the closeness of family not just as mother and son, but as two people clinging to each other in the storm of loss. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. Sarah wiped her tears, her heart aching but strangely lighter, as if Ethan's words had lifted something heavy she hadn't realized she was carrying. And then, just as the moment settled, a sudden knock rattled the front door. Sarah, startled, her hand flying to her chest. The sound was sharp against the quiet night. Who could it be at this hour? Snow was falling softly outside, blanketing the world in stillness. Very few people came by unannounced anymore, certainly not after dark. Ethan glanced at her, eyes wide. "Stay here," Sarah whispered, rising slowly. She pulled Daniel's shirt tighter around her shoulders, her heart racing as she crossed the room. Another knock came, firm but not impatient. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. She hesitated, the question Ethan had asked still echoing in her mind. Would you ever think about loving someone again? Her breath caught as she opened the door, and there, standing in the snow, was a man she had not expected to see.